So welcome to the State of Tech Enablement. My name is Marko. I'll be telling you a number of stories today. But before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about how this talk came about. So we also run a community called TechnoCon. So I see a couple of members from the community here. So awesome to see you all. And so this started back in 2018, 2019, initially at LinkedIn and then Twitter, and then moved online. And so we've been basically every month hosting a story from one of the companies, usually a Silicon Valley tech innovative company, telling a story of how they enable their people to do their best work. So what I've done is collected a number of the stories, organized them into things that are interesting, that are stories du jour that tell the arc of tech enablement and how people are addressing that. So that's what we're going to hear today. Feel free to ask questions as we keep going along. So you can use the chat. You can post the questions directly in the chat window. Feel free to send it to everyone. And if you want, feel free to also keep the camera on. It's up to you. We'll also have enough time at the end to answer questions. And I'll be sending you the deck afterwards via email. So there are a number of links in here, and I'll make sure you get it. So with that, let's get started. So what do we mean by tech enablement? Well, when I was at Twitter, our goal was to enable people there, namely engineers initially, and then everyone else, to simply do their best work. So essentially remove any impediments that exist in the way of people doing their best work. So there are a number of different approaches to that, and we sort of put an umbrella over a number of initiatives that companies typically do, and that includes everything from onboarding to general knowledge sharing to collaborative, sometimes called peer learning, mentorship coaching, office hours, technical documentation, and then also kind of tracking all that and figuring out what's working, what's not, and how to hone it in and how to optimize it. So we're going to explore a number of these topics today and see how companies are addressing this. Now, before we get started, when I sort of fell into this space, a couple of things I was hearing that were interesting was when we were small, everything was great, right? So, and this is typically at the startup stage or a smaller company, things just work. You don't really need technical enablement because everyone knows everyone. Everyone's pretty much in the same physical office, and the conversation channels are open to all. So that just works. As we scale, things start breaking down. So now, sometimes what we see at larger companies is that things are great within a team, but communication from team to team suffers. So essentially you end up with silos of knowledge. So team is doing great, but the organization is not nimble. So these are a couple of problems that we've noticed, and this is what we're going to be talking about, how companies address that. So with that, what is really the goal? Well, the goal is to remove organizational drag. So essentially, as you keep adding people, you are adding communication connections between those humans, and that number of connections grows quadratically. So essentially, you don't see the problem in a dozen or even 100-person organization. As you get into thousands or tens of thousands, suddenly things start to break down. And the way they usually break down is that adding more people does not result in additional productivity. So this is a challenge that we see. There was a manager that I worked with. His name is Alex Rudder. He ran engineering at Twitter at the time, and he would basically say that he called this organizational drag. So as we added people, the organization would slowly but surely start running slower and slower with more and more headcount. And eventually, the additional headcount does not equal additional productivity, and that is a problem for any tech leader. So with that, I'll address two stories to kind of start with. One is from Twitter, the other one is from Facebook. So Twitter definitely exhibits this problem. So when we were small, everything was great. If you wanted to spin up a project, you just go into your own corner with your own team, you spin up a project. If you wanted to pick, Ruby or Scala or Java or whatever tool you wanted, no questions asked, just go for it, right? Everything was free for all, and it was fine in the early days until it wasn't. So as we started hitting about 1,000 engineers, we started running into the cross-team issues. So again, my team is great, but I have no idea how to work with that team. Something's broken with those guys, right? And suddenly we started realizing that if as an organization we're going to need to run fast, we need to start agreeing on certain rules, right? As Alex would say, if you're on an island, it doesn't matter if you drive on the left side of the road or right side of the road. You're the only person driving on an island. The moment there's a second person on the island, you sort of need to agree on something, right? Are we going to drive on left and right? And it's not one is better than the other. It's just that what's required is that we agree on that. So similarly at Twitter, we ran into issues that some are very vivid, right? Java versus Scala. And if we pick two languages, then we have a problem of which tooling do we put in place? How do we get people up to speed on this or that, etc. So at some point, standardization and agreements matter to run faster at scale. And so one of the also things that kind of resonated with me when I was working with Alex was he basically said, look, we can hire additional 100 engineers, right? That's the size of a small company. We can hire that many engineers to get 10% productivity, or we can just make 1,000 engineers 10% more productive. So he was always leaning on, let's make existing people more productive and deliver on that promise. You come here to do your best work versus just throwing more bodies at a problem and dragging everyone down and kind of the culture ultimately suffers. So that's the story of Twitter. And by the way, all these stories have a full story. So if you click on this, and I'll send you the document afterwards, you can see and read the whole story. And there's usually the recording as well at the end. So that's kind of how that works. All right. The next one that kind of exhibits this is Facebook. And when I say Facebook, I don't mean Facebook today, the conglomerate. I'm really referring to Facebook when there were about 300 people altogether. So Wayne Chang ran engineering at the time. Wayne happens to be one of our investors. And so he's experienced this firsthand and is backing this whole initiative. And at the time, Facebook had this motto, I'm sure you've heard of it, run fast and break things. And that worked up to a point. And Wayne basically observed that breaking things was not conducive at scale, right? When you have millions and tens of millions at the time users, getting a new hire and making it easy for them to just break things is no longer cool. So they started investing in a way to provide what he calls guardrails, right? Like, how do we enable new hires to come join Facebook, get indoctrinated in the culture, in the way we do things, yet provide them with the guardrails so they can run fast and don't break things. So Wayne created, essentially funded the engineering bootcamp. Arguably, Facebook's engineering bootcamp is one of the best in the industry today. A lot of companies are sort of copy-pasting what Facebook has done. Now, what they've also done is they've changed their hiring process. So unlike a lot of other companies where you get hired into the team, so hiring manager is bringing you into the team. At Facebook, you get hired into the company, right? So you get hired into Facebook engineering. And then the engineering organization holds you back 4 to 6 weeks. So you may not even join your team for a month plus, right? And during that time, you really get a chance to get indoctrinated holistically into the engineering culture. And after that, you can sort of pick your team in some cases. So it's a very different hiring process, and that may make it harder to even get people into Facebook to begin with. So it's not just a matter of we'll change how we do engineering bootcamp. You also sometimes need to think about holistically changing the whole hiring process, which in itself is much harder. So those are the early days at Facebook. Like I said, about 300 people company. So we talk about this early, late stage. Another way to kind of think about this is, what is the maturity of your organization? And sometimes this is not related to the size of the company, nor the age of the company. So let's kind of look at what we call TEMI, or Tech Enablement Maturity Index. So let's look at different stages that we've observed companies go through it. Don't worry about reading all this text. I'll send you this afterwards. But essentially, level 1 is sink or swim. You know, it's like you come to a company, here's your MacBook Pro. That's what the patterns are, and good luck, right? And we've seen this at very large companies, and I'll mention some later on. Usually what happens next is somebody on engineering team had enough, and they just basically they raise their hand and say, you know what, I'm going to take this on. This is going to be my 20% time, right? And I'm going to take on making onboarding and up leveling and all these things that people need to work well. I'll make it my second job, essentially, right? And at some point, leadership gets it, and somebody formally owns it. So usually this is a TPM, and then eventually there's a complete ownership, like a person dedicated to it. And at some more mature companies, we see a fully funded teams. So we tend to often work with companies that are sort of TAMI level 3 to 5, where they already know they're sort of buying into the religion of tech enablement. They're just trying to make it all function better. So let's look at these various stages one by one. So sink or swim, essentially there's little or nothing in terms of onboarding. Onboarding often stops with HR. So here's your policies and procedures, your security key card, we took your photo, and here's your laptop, and good luck, right? And like I said, it's not necessarily just a matter of size of the company. So we worked with WeWork, and WeWork was 800 engineers at the time, and they were doubling. So significant headcount and significant growth, and yet they were at level 1 when it comes to technical enablement. It was basically a big hot mess. They recognized that, they brought us in to kind of solve for that, and then WeWork happens to go through the whole debacle that they did, and so the entire engineering team kind of got defunded, which is another problem in itself. GitHub, for example, I talked to their head of engineering, and they still have it to a certain level at HR owns it, and then it's up to the team. So in other words, at the Eng organizational level, there's very little support for creating that nimbleness across teams. At least that was true a couple of years ago. All right. So stage 2, usually somebody, like I said, steps up. It's usually an engineer, usually an old timer, somebody who cares about the culture, cares about the company, been there for a while, understands how things work, and says, I'm going to do something about this. This is a hot mess, right? So before we joined Twitter, there was a person, his name is Ryan King. He's now at CZI, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And so he was that old timer, and he basically stood up and says, I'm going to create a flight school. It was his extra work. And he did that, and it was super valuable at the time. And of course, it didn't scale because it was his second job, but that's how it started. There's also a story of Carbon Health that we're going to talk about shortly. So at some point, there is a partial ownership. So in addition to an engineer owning, onboarding, and everything else, usually somebody steps in that's fully responsible for this. At least it's part-time of their job. And like I said, often that looks like a technical program manager or a program, just a PM or program manager. So they own that. Like I said, we'll talk about this at Carbon Health. I've also seen this at Carta and some other startups that are sort of like starting to experience that rapid growth as well. Full ownership is when there is a person dedicated to this, and it's usually one person. And so this is the beginning of that. We have a deliberate method of enabling our people to do their best work. And there are lots of companies that are in this stage. Spotify will mention. Kia Motors, also being a little bit less on the tech side, is doing some really cool stuff. Cruise told the story of how they're thinking about that, and Credit Karma did some really cool stuff with that Credit Karma University in their early days. And as the company matures, usually there's a full-on team. So it's not just a particular person. So there's a much more of a support there. We'll talk about Microsoft, Salesforce later on, as well as Netflix and Twitter University, where I sort of cut my teeth. So that's a Tech Enablement Maturity Index. So 5 levels. So think about where you are, where you find your organization at, and then think about what would take to mature further. What does that arc look like, and how do you get from where you're at to where you want to be? And so usually there's a roadmap to that. So we'll explore how that pans out. So the next section, we're going to talk about some building blocks. And at the beginning of this, I sort of mentioned there's an umbrella that we put around things that we consider tech enablement, and it includes everything from onboarding to general knowledge sharing, peer learning, technical documentation, mentorship, coaching, office hours, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to look through that lens and see how that plays out. So before we do that, what's helpful is to kind of understand a journey of a new hire. And I'm using a new hire here as an example, but same is true for an existing person at your organization that is going to the next level. So it could be that it's an engineer that's becoming a staff engineer. It could be that's an engineer that's becoming a people manager, right? Like an engineering manager. So any such shift in responsibilities implies an ongoing onboarding. So onboarding is not just a new hire, it's a continuous process. Okay, so that's the key here. So usually what happens is you need to codify how you do things at your organization, right? Netflix calls it the Netflix way, right? So it's usually some kind of codification of culture. And we tend to work with companies that are very culture forward. So meaning they care about their culture quite a bit. And one of the reasons why they have such strong culture is that they actually codify it. So the culture becomes one of a design as opposed to a chance, right? So usually the way you codify that is it could be a self-paced content, such as, we have a wiki with a whole bunch of documents, or, some other e-learning content. Or oftentimes it could be a instructor-led training where the content is really presented by old-timers internally. So great. So you codified a bunch of knowledge and people get this knowledge dump, but it doesn't mean they get it, right? So often what's needed is practice. So practice is a way to have hands-on experience. It's a way to embody something, and it's a way to do that ideally with a community. So this is why, if you kind of compare this to physical fitness, right? This is why things like yoga or CrossFit work, but going to a gym solo hardly works because we just don't stick with it. So over and over again, humans tend to do better when they do things as a cohort, as a group activity. So this is why practice is important. And like I said, ideally that practice is with cohort as opposed to a solo single player experience, especially nowadays when we're talking about being, working from home and more isolated. There's more and more need for human connection and being connected. And we'll talk about this. Netflix Studios had an interesting case study on this. I'll mention it later. Now, great. I got a knowledge dump. I got to practice, got my hands dirty. And at some point I get stuck. Rubber meets the road. I'm actually doing my work and I learned all these things, but now I don't know how to launch that service, how to stand up that in production, how to check out that code, how to reason about that code base. Whatever that something is, you get stuck. So how do you get unstuck? How do people get unstuck on their hero's journey to becoming a better version of themselves? Well, so what we've seen is things like office hours, mentorship, coaching. Those are all ways to support people. Of course, you can always use Slack as well for that asynchronous communication, or email lists. They just tend to be a little bit sometimes more noisy unless they're searchable and well organized, because it tends to be one-on-one pings as opposed to a more organized and deliberate way to support people. So this is kind of how you transfer knowledge. Now, at some point, if you have a program, you may want to understand you have a feedback loop and understand how things are working. So that may look like assessments and surveys, and ideally that's integrated so that you don't have to hunt across multiple spreadsheets, but the data is there, so you can kind of figure out how things are going, and you can ultimately provide some kind of insights and data. And this is also useful for you as owner of tech enablement programs to sell up, because at some point management is going to come come back and say, hey, like, how valuable is this? And especially now when we're seeing daily, tech companies being slashing, headcount. How do you justify your own existence? Peloton, for example, had a very interesting case study, and they just went through a huge round of layoffs. But because the woman running the program was running Tech Enablement, not Tech Learning organization, her program was actually super strategic, and they got invested more into, as opposed to being slashed, which is typical for HR L&D programs in a downturn. So data and insights and being able to sell up and justify existence in ROI, super important, especially in the economy like this one. All right. So let's talk about onboarding. So we're going to start with that, and then we'll go into mentorship, coaching, tech docs, office hours, etc., etc. So onboarding usually is the lowest hanging fruit. People come into the company, they may be great engineers, they may be great data scientists, designers, whatever the technical folks are. You still need a way to indoctrinate them into how you do things there in your organization, into the way, right? So LinkedIn was one such company, and they had a program. They had a very robust engineering onboarding. We'll talk about that in a couple of case studies. But in this particular case, I wanted to reflect on their shift to remote first. So pandemic starts. We're working with them, and we kind of we help them with their live learning. So there was a lot of tech talks, workshops, classes, the entire engineering onboarding, everything happening, but it was happening in the offices. It was happening in Sunnyvale. If you became a new engineer, you would fly into Sunnyvale to get immersed into the culture. And then pandemic hits, okay? So within 3 days, the team was able to totally shift from in-person first to a blended experience that now spans across multiple geographically all over the world, and it's blended, and it still enables for that human touch, that connection. So they still leaned on heavily being volunteer instructor based. So they had instructors. They had to create a group of collective of instructors worldwide so they can adjust for time zones. They had to figure out, how do they blend things? Like, which parts are okay for you to do solo, right? For example, setting up your development environment. Well, that's probably a matter of fact. Here's a checklist, and go install this and install that and make sure this is connected to that, and you can log in, etc. But then things such as what's the stack of LinkedIn? Well, that requires a lot of context. It's not mechanical, it's not checklist, it's more of a deeper understanding. And that's something that is hard to document because it's tacit in nature, right? It's also something that it requires a lot of like, hey, I'm not understanding this. Can you help me out with that? Right? Like, can you explain this? So a lot of back and forth, which documents e-learning is such a poor choice for, right? And ultimately, once I'm starting to work on this, and in their case, their bootcamp is actually building a feature that spans end to end through their stack. If I get stuck, like I'm not able to do something, how do I get unstuck? Where do I go for support? Because that can be a total buzzkill if I'm stuck and don't have a way forward. So LinkedIn was able to address all that. And again, they didn't just take something that was fully in person and just dump it on Zoom. They actually meaningfully figured out how to break it in the entire arc of experience into a blended chunks, some being in person, some being documentation driven, etc. And they did this in 3 days and celebrated success afterwards. So it's still running as a blended experience. Uber had a similar experience, but with a twist. So Uber also moved on a dime to online. However, one thing that Uber has that was different or unique to them is that they have a mothership, obviously in Bay Area in San Francisco, but they also give a lot of autonomy to local teams. So for example, if we are the Uber team in Delhi, India, we may want to do some features differently because the way Uber is used in India is different than it's used in the United States. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to create one course with one content, but give local teams a way to localize it. So they were sort of like still blending, but they were also giving a local autonomy to teams to inject their own content, yet still provide for that nimbleness because there's one Uber, one sort of platform with local context. And so they launched that. They iterated, and finally got it down to something that they were quite happy with. So that was their move on the dime from in-person in Bay Area to being fully remote with a blended experience. I mentioned earlier carbon health. So this is less of a story of going on a dime to online only, but it's a more of a story of super rapid growth. So COVID happened, and carbon health literally went from 5 engineers to 90 in like something like 7 months. So that's an extreme growth in headcount, and they sort of went through the whole TEMI tech enablement maturity very quickly. So one person, she was an engineer. She was the first one. She was a hero, a volunteer. So she stepped in and basically said, I'm going to own this. I'm going to do something about that. She worked hard to organize the carbon health onboarding for new engineers. And but obviously soon she had so much work on her plate, couldn't do it all. So she got in a program manager. So the two of them teamed up and started working, and so she slowly handed it over to program manager. And then the program manager formed a mini team around them, and they kind of scaled that whole operation, and they were able to support that super rapid growth because they invested rapidly as well into enabling their people. Again, for all this, you have the full story in the recording in the link, and I'll provide this afterwards. So the next thing, if you remember the umbrella of tech enablement, we'll talk about peer or collaborative learning. So this is less about how do we onboard people. It's more about how do we socialize best practices, right? So if I'm an engineer, data scientist, designer, whatever, at some company, and I figured out a better way to do X, how do I communicate that and disseminate that to the rest of the organization so that everyone knows how to better do X, right? So that's the socialization, the passing on of wisdom across the ranks rapidly. And the faster the company does this, the faster the company learns, and those teams become more innovative. And obviously those companies are what we're talking about because they are winning, right? So let's go look at some of the examples. So my experiences with Twitter. So Twitter acquired my previous company. We went in-house when there were about 1,000 engineers and doubling. And our goal, our mission was to enable Twitter engineers to do their best work. And at the time, we were sort of TEMI index 1 or 2. There was basically very little support. There was a little bit of a flight school that I mentioned earlier, Inklings of that flight school, but it was a hodgepodge of stuff thrown into a kitchen sink. It wasn't very well organized nor deliberate, and etc. So we came in and basically started figuring out where are people stuck, where they're tripping up. And we kind of identified, lots of interviews, talked to a lot of people, looked at a lot of data because we were in-house and we were able to see this. And we sort of identified tools and libraries and services that were sort of at the core of everything that people do there, right? So most used, most poorly understood. So we focused on that. And we knocked at those teams' doors and basically said, hey, for example, I'll pick Pants. It's our build tool, or Finagle. It's one of the main libraries. So I would knock at the tool, the engineering manager's door of Finagle, and I would basically say, hey, Sonia, I don't know if you knew, but like a lot of people have really hard time using your tools. Like and the result of that is that your own engineers on your own team are spending up to 40% of their time on support. That was not accounted for. Right, so that support was happening through email, one-off email pings or Slack messages. And obviously 40% of your engineer's time going on support does not scale. So I basically said, hey, why don't we create a workshop around this? You need one engineer, 1 hour a month to kind of do this. We'll then create documentation up to that, etc. And we'll up level how we support your internal customers. And so we did that. and that worked really well. And then other teams started coming to us, other engineering managers, and said, "Hey, can you help us with our database? Or can you help us with our support on this library or that service?" And so it basically that created that peer learning internally that had to the university be the highest rated program in the engineering org. And we scaled it to something like 1 in 5 engineers was regularly teaching a class. We had about 10,000 student hours per month, so hundreds of classes. And this was at Twitter at about 2,000 engineers at the time. So it was a little bit of a success story, at least in engineering org. Spotify did something very similar. Again, we totally, separate, coasts doing separate things. They call it collaborative learning, but essentially it's the same approach. And what they noticed, their goal was to unlock innovation, right? So basically their insight was, if we have these pockets of knowledge, we're not innovating. Innovation happens when you collide these pockets of knowledge. So what they started doing is connecting those dots through collaborative learning. So a team X would stand up their own workshop, team Y would stand up their workshop, and they would naturally cross-pollinate and learn from one another. And through that, the entire organization became more nimble, more innovative, etc. Reduce the bottlenecks that are usually in the form of, I don't understand how things work, right? And because you were able to bridge those, break those silos, bridge those, team boundaries, you were able to unlock that. And so that provided more alignment, and through that, the whole company became more innovative. So quite a success story. And you can listen to Alex tell that story here as well. Netflix, we have a couple of stories with Netflix. We work with a number of teams there. We started with engineering, but then very quickly went into Netflix Studios. So for context, Netflix Studios, it's basically if you want to make a mini series internally or as one of the 10,000 contractors that they work with, you need to use their tools. And their tools are fairly complex. So again, it's not engineering, it's not programming per se, but it's making miniseries or movies. And yet it's very complex technically, because you have to understand this tool chain of dozen plus tools for recording and managing all the content assets, videos, etc. So they used to have a team that owned that, so maturity level 5, right? And as pandemic hit, they kind of thought, wow, this is great. We're just going to move everything to asynchronous. People are now working from home. They don't need to come to the office. We can just put everything online. Plus, we're Netflix. Isn't it great that everything is video, right? And so they kind of dialed the pendulum from live in person all the way to asynchronous single player solo experience, right? And what they observed is that they started losing that human touch. Right? So people were not connecting with one another. So it's the opposite of peer learning. All the things that you got with peer collaborative learning, where people optimize for serendipity, suddenly got lost. And so they kind of got stuck with that. And they're like, okay, well, how do we address that? That's obviously not healthy for our culture. And if you know anything about Netflix, you know that they care about their culture a lot. So they basically started offering, they call it Ask Me Anything sessions. It's basically office hours. And so they use that to kind of swing the pendulum back. So the idea was, okay, cool, you can still learn solo through videos and so on, but we're going to provide that human connection through office hours, to Ask Me Anything sessions. And that's where you get to connect and interact with the team behind the scenes face to face. Of course, it happened via Zoom online, and but they kind of spearheaded the program, and we helped them operationalize. So that's the story behind Netflix Studios. And we mentioned LinkedIn earlier in the context of moving through pandemic to online first. There's also another thing that LinkedIn did, and that was they kind of looked at a life cycle of an engineer, right? Like, so in the life of an engineer, I either build a tool internally, right? So platform team, or I am consuming a tool or a service or some part of that platform. So the application team. So you sort of have this internal teams that provide and internal teams that consume. And what they started following a life of each of those. And they noticed that the platform teams were building stuff, code, and throwing it over the fence, and then trying to really hard plug the holes in support. And that was building up more and more costs for them. They were not happy with that support, let's put it that way. On the flip side, the consuming team, the application team, they couldn't figure out where to go for stuff, right? Like, how do I learn how to use this library or that code or and the documentation, the workshops, the classes were not existent. It was all over the place. It was confusing. It was decentralized, etc. And so the team that owned this, the learning team, basically after having these insights, they said, let's kind of organize all this. The more knowledge we have, the more we need to care about curation, organization, discovery, having everything in one place, having it be ergonomic, easy to find, easy to share, and creating that culture where this is a first-class concern. And so they started focusing on that. They started optimizing for a single tool versus having multiple systems, making it simple to discover through that, improving the quality of content, so making sure that the content is zoned, that content is, they watch for drift, right? So like if your documentation is documenting something and that something changes, well, now documentation is drifting from what it's documenting. In other words, it's lying. So how do you manage for that, and how do you track that? So they started kind of spearheading that whole culture of making sure that people care about closing the knowledge gaps in their engineering org. So this is that story. So the next thing that you often hear in terms of tech enablement is the documentation. So this is a big one. Often what I hear from especially smaller company VPs of engineering is that they consider the culture of documentation the silver bullet, right? So if we documented, if everything's documented, life is going to be great. New hires will just come in and we'll have this rich wiki and everything's going to be there, and who go us, right? So at Twitter, I inherited the tech docs team, and it was a tiny team of technical writers. I was about 3-4 people at the time, and we had a Confluence. As a matter of fact, we had at the time one of the largest, if not the largest, Confluence installation. It was a couple of hundred. It was 250,000 pages across a couple of hundred spaces. And we worked closely with Atlassian to kind of hone in on optimize the search, because if you search for something, the problem wasn't that the document didn't exist. As a matter of fact, you would find a ton of documents, but they were all contradictory to one another, and you did not know which one was authoritative. So there was no such thing as canonical and authoritative documentation. There was no such thing as ownership. There was no such thing as freshness and measuring for drift and ease of discoverability and so on and so on. So we kind of set to change all this. I ended up replacing most of the team. So basically got rid of tech writers and got in engineers who like to explain things. And we also build a system so that we can have documentation live closer to code, right? So if it's a project docs or inline docs or API docs, that there's a group of docs that needs to be closer to what it's documenting, i.e. code. And so that way we could actually measure for drift. That way we could run linters and kind of figure out how close or far we are from things. And so there's a lot of goodness that came out of that. And so we kind of implemented the system. It was a big cultural shift. We ended up talking about this at Write the Docs conference. And it's one thing where Google actually copied Twitter. So I'm kind of proud of that, because we usually copied Google. And so the following year, Google basically said how they moved toward this approach as well. So did LinkedIn and a couple other companies. So there's a story here that is worth exploring. We organized a panel at Technocon, and we had quite a few presenters from, I'll show you so you can kind of see, but we basically had presenters from companies like Spotify, Splunk, Uber, and LinkedIn talk about that. They're known for their culture of documentation. So you can read about this, or you can watch the panel discussion as well. So that's a quick overview of technical documentation. We have a couple more things under our umbrella of tech enablement. So mentorship, coaching, and office hours, really quickly. So, so this is basically, unlike workshops where I have a curriculum and a plan and things that I want to deliver to, one-to-many, right? Mentorship, coaching, office hours is usually ad hoc. There's no curriculum. There's no what we're going to talk about. It's very much whatever that person needs. And it's more often than not one-on-one. Sometimes it's a small group discussion, such as office hours, but usually it's one-on-one. So it has its purpose. And we've seen a couple of different use cases for this approach, these types of programs. So a buddy system is pretty common, right? It's often used for onboarding. If you don't have anything else, usually a new hire is paired with an old timer, so it becomes a buddy, right? For some amount of time. So that person is usually there so that the new hire can shadow them. Now, sometimes it's more about career mentors, right? So I am an engineer. I want to become a staff engineer, and I'm looking for somebody to mentor me. Or I'm an engineer and I want to become an engineering manager. So again, I need somebody to kind of mentor me on that transition. So that would be what we call mentors. Now, sometimes it's about coaching. So example of that is maybe I'm a freshly minted engineering manager. Okay, great. Now I'm stuck. I have a situation. I have somebody I need to manage on my team. I don't know. I've never kind of experienced this. I'm stuck and I'm looking for coaching about this particular topic. So as opposed to longer arc of career mentorship, this is more situational. Like I'm stuck on this particular thing and I'm looking for coaching. So that would be professional coaching. And then there's office hours, which is very transactional often. So I'm working on, spinning up a service. I don't understand something. I go to the team that owns, say, the SRE team or, DevOps team, and I knock at their doors asking about a specific thing. So it's very much office hour-ish type of experience. Still small group or one-on-one in nature. So let's go look at a couple of stories to illustrate this. So Airbnb, again, another company very famous for their culture. They approached us a couple of years. So we ran peer learning for them. And then they said, well, this is going great. We would like to launch a peer mentorship program. So we kind of worked with them on figuring out what that looks like. And so the result was they spun a program where anyone at Airbnb can become a mentor. Now, what does it mean to become a mentor? Well, first you need to take a training. So there was an official workshop that you would go through. It was about 4 hours. It was based on something called the GROW method. And once you complete that workshop, you're now quote unquote certified as a mentor. So you can now open up your mentorship sessions. So you can promote them on the platform, and people would promote it. And then other employees at Airbnb could go to that platform and discover those mentorship sessions and say, I would like this person to mentor me, click availability, bam, pair up and do that. So they launched that. They actually presented, Anna presented at TechnoCon 2019, which we held at Twitter as an annual. And she shared that within 1 year, they went from 0 to 10% of population becoming mentors. So about 500 internal employees became peer mentors. And they ran hundreds of sessions, and it was one of the very highly rated programs at Airbnb. So there's a story from TechnoCon there. Now, Shopify, they actually presented the previous year. They had a different approach. So Toby, their CEO, he had a personal executive coach, and that coach made all the difference for Toby as he was building Shopify. And so he thought, well, this is great. Like, if it's so powerful for me, I would love to bring this coach to my entire executive team. So he did, and it made a huge difference on executive team. And so he looked further. How do we now bring coaching to all of Shopify? And at the time, it was about 4,000 employees. How do we now empower, democratize something that was traditionally available only to the upper echelon? How do we make that available to everyone? And so they ended up buying essentially a dozen coaching practices, mostly in Canada, but so they wanted the coverage across time zones and major locations, so Montreal, Toronto, San Francisco, etc., and also English versus French, right, being a Canadian company. And they launched their coaching program fully democratized for every employee at Shopify. So run by a professional. So unlike peer learning peer mentoring at Airbnb, this was run by professional coaches at Shopify, trained in integral coaching theory. Dropbox presented also at Technicon, and they told the story of their roadmap. So they have basically their journey, and they started in 2019 with sort of a traditional, let's study the C-suite, let's study the external coaches, let's bring them, this highly paid external contractors and pay them for just our executive suite. And then let's extend that to, more people managers, and then eventually kind of democratize this and make it to everyone. So they outlined their roadmap in this talk. We need to do a follow-up on them, how to kind of reflect on how that's working. But it's really interesting to even think about how they kind of reasoned about this roadmap to democratizing and scaling coaching operation. And final story here in this section is Autodesk. They did something different. They used group mentoring for their newly minted engineering managers. So they basically observed, and this is common in the industry, right? Usually engineering managers come from the ranks of engineers, meaning they've never managed humans before, right? And sure, we all have our, kind of signature trainings that we give to such, new engineering managers. But then people are stuck, and rubber meets the road. How do you kind of get unstuck? How do you solve for that? And often with management, things are less technical in nature and more soft, and which means also confidential, right? Harder to kind of like Google and figure out, right? So what Autodesk did is they created a program which is basically I call that a forum, but it's a closed group of people who are not reporting to one another, so there's no conflict of interest within the group, so that you can create a level of deep trust, right? And usually in that group, they would have one of the old-timer experienced engineering managers basically be there to kind of offer a time and space for new EMs to ask questions, to compare notes, to learn from one another through peer mentorship, peer coaching in a forum environment. So this is what Autodesk did to support their new EMs. So finally, just kind of one of the final things I want to not forget is external expertise. So everything we talked about so far was how to share internal knowledge through either onboard new people, document it, provide, one-on-one coaching mentorship office hours, or do more of a scaled up peer collaborative learning, but that's all with expertise inside of the building. Now, there's also use case for expertise outside of the building, and that's more readily available. And as such, it's a little bit less interesting because there's so much of it, and it's all great. You just go and buy it. But I wanted to mention it nonetheless in a couple of cases. So one of the companies, we've been working with Salesforce for 6+ years now, which is actually our first customer, and talk about scale, right? So there are 18,000 engineers, fully global around the world. And being a little bit more of a stable technology, they had less need for internal knowledge sharing because they've been around for a while, one of the more mature companies of all that we've talked about today. Yet they wanted to provide a way for people to learn advanced Java, machine learning, agile methodology, et cetera, et cetera. So what they've done is they actually built a team of external vendors. And as a matter of fact, the company that we sold to Twitter used to be a vendor to Salesforce once upon a time. That's kind of how I knew them to begin with. And we used to teach internally classes on Java, Scala, Hadoop, Android, etc. So they're basically augmenting their internal learning, their internal university, by bringing in external vendors. Now, to internal people, these external vendors appear like an internal employee. So it's really a moot point for the most part. This is just how they scale the operation because they have such a big learning and development operation internally. So that's Salesforce, and that's at scale. Now, going to a totally other spectrum of size, one of the smallest companies we worked with, SSENSE, they when I started with them, there were 40 engineers. They're now 250, and they just did a story of how they transformed the company. It's actually a huge Canadian sort of startup success. But at the time, they were tiny, and they were just launching their technical university. And what they wanted to do is send their people to external conferences, but the catch was that if you go to a conference, you have to come back and do a talk. You have to present back what you learned. So that was kind of the way they motivated bringing that external knowledge in, and also kind of taking care of their people and their culture by supporting you to go out into conferences. Plus, being in Montreal, there's not a lot going on, so going to a conference in San Francisco or Boston or New York is a perk. So that was also a welcome thing for their engineering team that, like I said, it's been a success story in terms of how they grew it. Final, measuring success. So great, you have this technical enablement programs. You picked and choose between, onboarding, documentation, mentorship, coaching office hours, peer learning, etc. How do you know if it's working, right? How do you kind of track all that? And there's different tools that we hear, and it's usually a hard one. So we hear everything from Kirkpatrick scale to just kind of listening for that squeaky wheel, to measuring zero to productivity, measuring attrition or retention, and how easy or hard it is to hire into the company because what people know about you externally and so on. So let's look at two stories that illustrate this. So Microsoft, talk about scale. Microsoft onboards 1,000 engineers every single month. Okay, so most of our companies are not even 1,000 engineers. They onboard that many every single month. They're over 100 plus thousands of engineers. So it's like basically a small town, right? And they have a very mature learning organization. As a matter of fact, they have a number of organizations. Chris Schaefer, who is the boss of all that, he's actually a board member at Technicon. And so this is the story of one of their people, and how they approach measuring what's working, what's not. And they've put a lot of thought into this, and they have a lot of data. And so a couple of things to kind of, as a takeaway, they want to make sure that their people have enough time to learn and be supported, that there's enough resources, and that the managers are encouraging all this and working with people to enable them to grow. Talking about board members, so Rajan was at LinkedIn, and he was actually one of the people that him and I and Jenny from Salesforce started Technicon back in the day. So at LinkedIn, he spearheaded their bootcamp, engineering bootcamp, and he was very thoughtful about measuring success. He's actually going to do a talk, an upcoming talk on how to do this. But he leaned on Kirkpatrick as the model. And if you don't know Kirkpatrick, level 1 is basically a happy sad face right after the event, say for example a class. Level 2 is did you get it, right? So it's usually some kind of quiz. For Rajan, it was doing a demo at the demo day, which was more meaningful than doing a multiple choice or a quiz. Level 3 is are you using what you learned? And so he would do this through feedback, usually 30 to 60 days afterwards. And level 4 is what's the impact of you learning something on the business? Like, it's great that you're learning as an employee, but like, what does that really mean for the business? So what he did is he would basically survey the managers, again, 60 to 90 days afterwards, and ask them the question. So again, full story here, and it's quite an interesting one. So finally, what are we seeing? So just to kind of close the talk here, we're seeing general trends that remote first work is here to stay. It's slowly transforming into hybrid. That's making it even more complex to navigate. So we're now talking to all the members of Technicon on how they're approaching this. So it's a little bit of figuring stuff out that's happening. One thing's for sure, that blended is more and more the way to go. So it's a combination of single player, solo e-learning, and live cohort-based multiplayer learning experience, sort of that immersive experience. So it's blending this in a meaningful way. And we're also seeing tech enablement become a thing. So as opposed to being just a something that we coined, it became something that we're seeing people hire for. And I mentioned earlier Peloton, where they transformed their team from tech learning to tech enablement, and as such became a strategic investment in the company. And the team is thriving now, doing well, despite the fact that the company had massive layoffs. So that's also an interesting story. That story is coming up and it's going to be published on Technicon, in the Technicon community. And I'll be sharing the deck with you, so you will have all this with the links to all the stories. So that's coming your way right after this. All right. Well, thank you all. It was fun, and I really appreciate your time. And be in touch.